Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. When you get the church collection plate and look inside, do you see $85 billion? That's what you would see if American Christians gave 10% of their income yearly. What would that do? It would transform the world. Our guest today is going to talk to us about the motivations and the practices of charitable giving. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Patricia Snell, researcher at the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at Notre Dame, and one author of Passing the Plate: Why American Christians Don't Give Away More Money. Welcome, Trish.
Thank you.
This was an important book on a very timely subject about how to meet the world's needs through charitable giving. How did this book come about? You have a generosity research project at Notre Dame. Was that part of it?
Actually, the book preceded that project. Basically, we were interested in learning a little bit more background information on how much people do give, and interested in exploring religious financial giving in particular. And then out of that, we started a background project that actually led to what is now the Science of Generosity project at Notre Dame.
So you studied a lot of surveys that were already out there, plus did some interviewing.
That's right.
What part of that gave you the best data for your book?
I think they both gave us great data, but in different ways. So the survey data gave us a picture, overall what was happening nationally, and sort of a representative picture and a lot of numbers. And so it's always great to balance that out with the interviews and hearing from people in their own words, their own stories about how they think and feel about giving.
So you're talking about American Christians here and the kind of whether it's in church or other outside of church, the kind of giving they're doing overall yearly. Isn't that the sort of basis of the numbers in the book?
Yes.
And you found, unfortunately, that Christians actually don't give as much as they could.
That's right. The numbers are, we sort of knew going into it that they were probably going to be fairly low, but they were lower than we expected.
Because sometimes we hear, Americans are so generous, or, in the world, Americans give a lot of money, but that wasn't really the best measure, was it? That we happen to give more than people who don't give much at all?
Because a lot of Americans don't give the amount that they profess to want to give or believe that they should give. And it winds up being around 6% of annual income. And that's if you take everybody into account and you do an average. And so what we even found there is, if you tease that apart, you see it's very skewed toward high givers. And so if you really actually get into sort of the median range, it's more like $200 a year, which comes out to just over about half of 1%.
Think about that. $200 a year. And I think if your if I remember your numbers correctly, you said that an average Christian, American Christian, was making somewhere between $47,000 and $57,000. So based on that amount of money, people were giving on an average of $200 to all causes, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it's pretty pitiful, isn't it?
It's pretty low.
Yeah, it is. Now, this isn't a book about judgment. It really was a book about understanding then. Why is it that people who do believe that it's important to give can't make it happen?
And we really wanted to hear from people in their own words how they make sense of that, right. It was an interesting puzzle even in the interviews themselves, because people on the one hand would say that they believe in giving more than they themselves give. And so the contradiction was apparent in almost every interview that we did with parishioners.
What was so amazingly wonderful about your book was that you proved that if people would give a tithe, or 10%, that's sort of the biblical mandate, correct? That the tithe is a 10% gift?
That's one of the ways that people look at it. There are some congregations that tend to think of tithe as not necessarily specifically 10%. It's a little bit, it depends a little bit on the denomination, I guess, how that's interpreted.
Yeah, so there really isn't maybe a general understanding of that tithe idea.
That's right. It's fairly confusing, and even the language of whether or not the word tithe is used versus stewardship versus donation, there's a lot of confusion on that out there, I'd say.
Although some folks did know, when one survey said that 70-some% of people did know that the word tithe meant 10%.
That's correct. People are generally aware of the term, but whether or not they use it themselves, or it's interesting. In some congregations, it seemed that 10% was considered a minimum, and stewardship was what you did above that. In other places, stewardship was sort of whatever you were called to do, and then 10% was a standard that maybe wasn't being met. So there was variance all across the board in terms of how people understood it.
What was and now I get back to that, so amazing about your book was that you proved that if committed Christians, and I think you define it as people who go to church maybe twice a month or say that they're a very strong Christian, if they gave that 10%, we would have $85 billion a year to give away.
That's right.
$85 billion is an astronomical amount of money. Did that impress people, or did people catch a vision for that, you think, when they heard what that could do in the world?
I think that's one of the parts of the book that impacts people the most, because regardless of how people understand the word tithe or all of that, I think generally people think giving somewhere around 10% is a good idea, and to think that if people could just bump from 2 to 10% or somewhere in that range, that there would be so much more out there in the world that could be done. It's just amazing how to see it sort of add up across so many different people.
In your book, you do a really neat job of setting out what would happen if you could spend $85 billion. And actually, $85 billion is kind of hard to spend yearly.
Right.
Let me just, we have a chart here that just gives some examples of what we could do. You could give $4 billion a year for Bible translating, printing, or distribution. You could give $4 billion to economic development projects in the world. You could give another $4 billion for 2 million new clean water wells that people desperately need. Another $8 billion to prevent malaria, and another $9 billion to shelter all the refugees in Africa, Asia, and Middle East. Mm-hmm. That is just convicting about what we could do.
Right.
And that doesn't even make $85 billion.
That's right. I think one of the amazing things about all those numbers is thinking about how many individual lives could be affected if people could just give a little bit more. What
was convicting to me is you always hear this phrase, well, how can you believe in God when there is all this poverty or all of this suffering in the world? And I thought to myself, if Christians just did what was not even a maximum amount, you talk about a reasonable amount of giving, you get to keep 90%. Mm-hmm. If you just gave 10%, actually Christians who are supposed to be God's representatives did what they were supposed to do, we would have less suffering. We would have more flourishing for people. God would get a better reputation.
It's amazing how many things we found in the book sort of prevent people from being able to see it that way. And it seems like when they have the time to sort of sit with thinking about it like that people feel called to give more. Yeah. But there's just so many different distractions and whatnot that happen in our lives that prevent us from really being able to understand it like that. One of my favorite stories from the book actually was one of the pastors who said the way he tries to help people understand that concept is by saying, he passes along a story that his father, who was also a pastor, taught to him, which said, if I give you 10 apples, would you be willing to give me one back? And I just thought that was a great representation of exactly what's being asked.
And it's so simple. Yeah. And it feels like so doable. Mm-hmm. So what did you find was like a number one reason why people didn't give?
We found that it's a pretty complicated story. It seems like there's a variety of different ways. Actually, the impression that we got was the longer we talked to folks, the more we realized it's sort of amazing that people can overcome all these different hurdles, because it seemed like there were so many different ways that people were sort of prevented from acting out what they wanted to do. And I would say one of the ones that struck me the most was just how confused people were on the topic, and how much it seemed like they just really didn't get time to practice thinking or talking about this with anybody else. And so even in the interviews themselves, it seemed like just that time to sort of become aware and think through it more was making a change. just because they hadn't really had the chance to think about it.
Right, and I think you make the point in the book that if people actually sat down and thought about tithing or giving as a fixed expense, so you have your mortgage, you have your car payment, you have your utilities, and you have your giving, your tithe, that actually people gave a lot more when they had that pre-thought, this is what we're going to set aside for the year.
That's right. That's right. And you also realize in talking with people how much just those two, the house payment and the car payment, can really make a difference in whether or not they feel like they have the means to give. And so being able to take that into account before those costs become fixed amounts is another important part of it.
So really adjust how big a house you might buy or how new a car you might have just a little bit, and you could actually find that 1/10 of your income.
That's right.
What about the fact that most people, especially in tough economic times, feel like, I don't have the money? Do American Christians actually have the money?
They do. In general, there's a subjective sense that the money may not be there, but in fact, you know, the statistics show that objectively the resources are there, and that it actually tends to be folks who have less money who actually give more of a percentage of their income. And also we see that trends over time are that, for instance, during the Great Depression, people actually tended to give more on average than they do during times of more economic boom.
Yeah, the whole consumerism, you know, that actually you talked about the fact that our culture encourages selfishness and discourages sort of restraint, because you need to have a little bit of restraint in order to have some money freed up from your regular expenses to give away. But boy, you go everywhere and the message is buy, you know, discard, buy new. So it's needs a community, it seems to me, to remind us that there's something greater than all of this consumer spending.
And I think in the research that we've done since the book, I've been becoming more aware of the fact that some folks even think that they are giving 10%. Because we are doing a study now where we're actually able to match their giving to their actual giving behavior. And there are a number of folks who actually think that they are giving 10% when they're not. And I think what happens is, like you were saying, that people wind up spending their budget in a variety of ways throughout the month. And then they think about what they have left over, and they maybe think of 10% from that.
Right, it's the extra, the 10% of what I have extra.
And without realizing that adds up to considerably less than 10% of their income over the course of the year. And
you're actually talking about after-tax income. You know, there's a little bit of a debate on whether it should be pre-tax or after-tax, but your $85 billion figure is after-tax money.
Right.
And you also proved in the book that between 1959 and today, while incomes have actually gone up in a major way, our spending on entertainment, sports, gambling, photography, all those kinds of little extra things has also gone up exponentially. Mm-hmm. So again, you sort of have gently said, that's what I got from your book. It was really sort of a gentle layout of here are the facts. Take it for what they're worth and examine your life.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We're really just trying to understand where people are coming from in thinking through this topic, and we definitely all had a sense that this is something that's complicated for folks, and that it can be challenging to figure out.
And that's why, being a sociologist, it's really helpful to get at the underlying causes of these kinds of things, mm-hmm. because as you examine them, you might be able to make a change.
I really got the sense in conducting this research that even taking the time to think about it could make a significant change in people's lives.
Now, churches, another interesting study in the book is that if churches started to press this issue and made it more clear and said, look, folks, this is a spiritual issue. This is not just necessarily a voluntary thing. It's a reflection of your commitment. People left those churches. They didn't want to stay with clergy who were pretty upfront about it.
Yeah, it depended a little bit I should say a great deal actually, on the approach. We heard a lot of different sorts of reactions, and we also really got the sense how difficult this would be for pastors and priests to talk about, because there were so many different ways that people could interpret it. I mean, we heard everything from, we don't like it when the pastor talks about it, we'd prefer, congregation members to talk about it, to we don't like it when congregation members talk about it, we would like the pastor to talk about it, and everything in between. between. But it really seemed that that people were the most comfortable when giving was talked about, but it wasn't something that they felt was being demanded of them or something that they sort of felt guilted into doing or something like that.
So expectation versus a demand.
That's right.
Like, just give a clear expectation, and so that people could rise to their very best.
Yes.
When it came to, in fact, the Mormon faith actually is very clear about their expectation, and they outgive everyone, don't they?
They're significantly higher.
Significantly higher, and also Jewish individuals. There's a kind of a cultural expectation, religious faith expectation that they'll give as part of their faith expression, and they do. I think your book shows that Catholics actually give the next, and then Protestants are behind that.
Yes, and you get the sense from that part of the issue too may just be that people don't really get the chance to talk among each other, because I think that in the Mormon experience it's much more common to be talking about giving, and because the expectation is so clear and everybody knows about it, it's not considered as much of a private matter. And I do think that that's one of the issues, is that people don't really know what's happening with other people in the church, and so they don't get as much time to sort of think through or be inspired by each other or any of that.
One of the things that I've heard from one of the philanthropists in our area is that the reason that they want to be public about their giving is so that it will be an encouragement for other people. And sometimes people will say, well, you should be private and behind the scenes, but your book makes it pretty clear that the more we can do this as a community with a community expectation, the better the giving will be.
I think that people get concerned that if they talk about it more, they might make each other uncomfortable.
Right.
But the book pretty much shows that folks are uncomfortable privately, and that it might actually be helpful to be able to talk about it more with each other.
You also had some interesting reasons why people give. The top one being that it really is a biblical principle, although it's been secularized, which is, to whom much is given, much is expected. That was the number one reason. So people were really motivated out of a very good, generous sense.
That's right, and I think those who saw themselves as giving more and were more involved in the entire concept just tended to think of it as something, a goal that was needed to constantly be work toward, something that could never really be reached, but that you always had to work at.
And then another high reason that people gave was because they were asked.
It's amazing. It just really struck us how many people just hadn't really been asked, or they were in a church where it just wasn't really talked about that much.
But when the need was placed in front of them, a concrete need, people were really drawn to that.
I think that people in general appreciate something being clear and feeling really called to do something.
So if people have a regular opportunity to give, you found that they actually gave more than the sort of sporadic, maybe being prompted to give, or a particular item came up.
That's right. I think that, again, that's because in general we also don't get a great deal of practicing math and statistics and percentages, and so I think when people give sporadically, it's harder to see what percentage that might add up to over time, whereas when people sat down and kind of systematically planned it out and adjusted other costs accordingly, they were easier. It was easier for them to be able to match up their behavior with what they actually wanted to do.
One of the things that when I was young, when you go shopping and you see a sale and it says 30%, like, how do you figure out what 30% of that sale item is? And I was always taught, well, just start with the 10%. That's an easy way to figure it out. So in some ways, if you were paid $500 a week, and you just looked at your paycheck and said, that's what I get after tax, I have to give $50 this week. Or I have to give $50 times 50 weeks. And so this year I'm going to give $2,500. Think about how many neat causes could benefit from $2,500.
And when it's broken down like that, I think it feels much more tangible to folks, and especially because I think when people have a very clear picture of it like that, they realize how much, for instance, being away from church for a week or something like that could make a difference and add up over time. Right. Whereas when people are giving when they're there and they haven't really sat down to see that whole picture, they don't realize how much that subtracts from what they would otherwise want to give.
It was an interesting statistic where it said that 5% of the people American Christians give 59% of the total donations.
That's right.
That's a pretty staggering idea.
It's very skewed.
It's very skewed. So there must be some joy that those individuals are receiving, and the practice, I bet, actually helps them to do it more regularly.
When people are able to kind of get their behavior more in line with their beliefs and be able to carry that out and see that happen, it's something that they themselves enjoy and want to do more of.
Do you think that churches feel okay about you giving not only to your local body, but also to other causes outside of church? Did you find any research about that?
Sure. Most of the churches, the pastors that we spoke with talked about giving to church or other causes. And what's interesting is in the book, we were not actually focused specifically on just giving to churches. So the figures actually represent giving anywhere to any charitable cause. And what we found was that the folks who did give higher amounts actually tended to give higher amounts also outside of the church. So they gave both higher to the church and to other charitable causes.
Right. So again, that idea that the more you practice, the more it becomes part of your regular habits, which is a neat thing. Now, you have a great phrase in the book that says that pastors should not give a vision just to pay the bills, but a much bigger vision. I think it's to live the vision of being God's hands and feet in the world. And so often, if you have even a struggling church, say, well, we've got to say we've got a budget of $500,000. So if we've got 100 members, that's X dollars for all of us to give. Versus saying, what would we like to be, right? What would we like to have as a mark of our body together, of our congregation together? And do pastors feel comfortable, you think, in giving that vision?
I think it really varies. Some of the pastors seemed very comfortable with helping people to think about giving as something that was part of their Christian lifestyle and not just something that the church needed. But other pastors just clearly conveyed that they didn't feel comfortable talking about giving at all, would rather that part of the year would not go away. And I think it was in those cases often that people said, well, I'll just tell them what it is that we need to pay. We need to get the roof fixed or whatever, and I'll just tell them that and let's get it over with. And you could really see how it was an uncomfortable topic for a lot of pastors to have to talk about.
Right, and yet we certainly know that in the midst of consumerism, overspending, the idea of how to handle your resources is pretty much an important spiritual issue for individuals today, especially with, even in tough times, adequate income. How are you going to use that money? So I can see why pastors feel uncomfortable about it, but it also seems to me to be a fairly central message.
Yeah, I would say that the Live the Vision approach, pastors who talked about that tended to focus more on seeing money as part of a broader system, basically, that they were helping folks to understand and Christians to live out. And so it wasn't, okay, we have to talk about money and
right.
I'll just get to that when I can. It's much more about people need help with this, and this is part of what I'm helping them to do, is understand how to walk their beliefs.
So living the vision, if you really had a commitment to orphans, widows, refugees, health, flourishing in other countries, you might say, let's keep our church expenses low, right? Let's sort of have a simple exterior here so that we could have a broader influence in the world. Did you find any churches doing that?
We did find that. We even found some churches who talked about actually tithing out of their church budget to other organizations and other folks. And that was something that whenever parishioners were aware that was occurring or talked about that as happening in their church, that they always spoke positively about that also made them want to give more to their church, as sort of, we called it the giving screen, as in they could give to the church and know that those resources then would go out of the church to other good causes.
So there is that, like your story, I've been given 10 apples, so I want to give my 1 apple away. And this idea of doing it in community, so you get out of that my money is mine, that little privatization of what we do with our money, and having our world expanded through the community endeavor, knowing what other people are doing, catching their vision.
It does seem to have more of an impact.
Some people think that the church shouldn't ask for a specific amount. Did you find any reasons why people were resistant to having people say this is what you have to give?
We did, and it depended. I think it just depends a lot on the denomination and the religious tradition, because a number of churches are quite happy with the standard of 10%, and that the pastors in those churches are easily able to talk about that, and people agree with that. But there are other places where people are really kind of resistant to that idea. They don't think that it should be required, shouldn't be a standard of 10%, or pastors even talked about they specifically do not want to say that it's 10%, that it's more, if you can just give 2 or 5 or something like that, and that we don't have to have a specific standard. So there was variance in terms of that.
Well, your book was able to almost give us a little course on why to give, what may be some of the reluctance we have towards giving, and what could be some of the proactive ways we could change our behavior. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
My guest today has been Patricia Snell, one author of Passing the Plate, Why American Christians Don't Give Away More Money. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.